Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. I hope you were able to get some notes down for the first day of Reconstruction Notes. I would suggest taking notes again today for part two. And we're going to start off by talking about the new amendments that were made during Reconstruction. Now, the first thing that we think about with the Civil War is the idea of slavery. And ultimately, that's what this war was being fought about, or what was being fought over, was slavery. So in 1865, the war was over. The 13th Amendment passed very shortly thereafter. A couple years later, we found that it was necessary to create the 14th Amendment. Initially, Andrew Johnson was against this amendment. He did not feel that it was necessary. His view on slaves or former slaves was a little bit different than what the radical Republicans' view was. The radical Republicans wanted the slaves to be transitioned into normal life, normal citizenship, give them all the rights that white people have at the time, but that was not given to them. There were several things put into place in the South, especially, that prevented African Americans from having the same rights as whites at the time. So the 14th Amendment was that first step to making sure that slaves or former slaves are being treated fairly. And basically what this 14th Amendment does is it creates equality, or the idea of equality, no matter what your race is. So in 1868, the 14th Amendment passed, and it gave citizenship to freedmen and required that states give everyone due process of law and equal protection of the laws. And basically what this does is make sure that these people are being safe, or given safety through the protection of our laws. Now, there were some things put into place in the South, which we'll talk about in a moment, things like the Black Codes. And part of some of the Black Codes prevented African Americans from participating in things like elections. Some of them were being arrested unfairly and not being given a trial with a due process, with a proper amount of time for that trial. So in 1870, they had to once again make another amendment regarding the issue of slavery or former slaves, and this one was about voting. And voting is going to be extended to African Americans through the protection of the 15th Amendment. So in 1870, the 15th Amendment says that any person can vote regardless of their race. Now, one thing to point out here, women still do not have the right to vote. It does not matter what their color is, white or African American, Hispanic, no women can vote yet. This is specifically talking about African Americans or anyone of any race. So keep that in mind as we move forward and how we see things change and what laws are being extended to African Americans at this time. Okay. Moving on here. Freedmen. That's a word that we use for African Americans that were former slaves and are now free men. Freedmen. That's where that word comes from. Now it says, during Reconstruction, people viewed and treated freedmen in contrasting ways. I'm going to pause right there, and I'm going to go back real quick because I forgot to tell you to write something down, and you need this. So write this down. 13th, 14th, 15th. Write that down. 13, 14, 15. And then I want you to write beside 13, I want you to write down free. Next to the 14th, write citizens. And next to the 15th, write vote. So 13, 14, 15, free, citizens, vote. Okay? And that's how that goes. 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment made them citizens. And then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Free, citizens, vote. 13, 14, 15. Okay? Please write that down. You need to know that. Okay? All right. Moving back. Sorry about that. Little distraction. I forgot about that. Okay. So freedmen, they are now free. They are not slaves anymore. Now, they are going to face very different treatment from different places. Now, as you can imagine, freedmen in the South, you think they're going to be treated better or worse than the freedmen in the North? What do you think? Yeah, obviously they're going to be treated worse in the South. So freedmen in the South, not treated well. Southern states, a lot of southern states passed what they called black codes. Now, these black codes are laws written specifically for black people. And these black codes basically controlled these freedmen and took away some of their rights. For example, there were some black codes that made it illegal for blacks to hold religious ceremonies without the presence of supervision from white people. Um, Certain areas did not allow blacks to own guns. Certain areas did not allow blacks to receive education, formal education or public education. Okay, so the black codes, they were intended to oppress the black people, and they wanted to make sure that the white people stayed in control. That was the whole purpose of the black codes. So these black codes were allowed. Unfortunately, Andrew Johnson, he didn't see much of a problem with this. He felt that this might be necessary. And he felt that maybe keeping these people split apart might prevent some conflict. So he was okay with this, unfortunately. Now, in other areas, we see people really reaching out to try to help these former slaves. One example of this is the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help slaves or former slaves get back into the real world, or really enter the real world for the first time as a citizen and not a slave. Uh, Part of this included giving them food, clothing, education. Um, they even taught them how to search for a job, what sort of jobs they would be able to do. And they even would, at times, help reconnect families who were split apart during slavery. So the Freedmen's Bureau was set up as a way to help African Americans get that first step they need into entering society as freedmen. Um, the New South, some people refer to this when we are talking about Reconstruction and what it looks like uh, after the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments have passed. Uh, Part of what the New South is looking for is a way to survive without slavery. There's going to be some workarounds for this. There's going to be an attempt to continue this practice of free and reduced labor so that they can still be an agricultural society and not have to pay those labor costs uh, just like they've been used to for the past couple hundred years with the use of slaves. But this is going to look different. And there are some people in the South, and this is where we get the idea of the New South. There's some people that realize we've got to find a new way to make money. We've got to revamp our economy. We've got to rethink the idea of how to make profits in the South. So the first thing you might write down for the New South is that the South aimed to not just be an agricultural society, but also to start building factories and become more industrialized like the North is. So I would definitely take note of that. There are some areas in the South that are going to experience this industrialization movement that the North has had for several decades now. Okay. Um, Now, there are some farmers that are not going to be able to do this. They are farmers by trade. They've got thousands of acres. Their land has been owned by their family for so long. They're not going to be able to just up and build a factory and start a new way of life. So some of these Southerners started doing what they called sharecropping. Okay. I'm sure you've heard of what a sharecropper is, but I want to remind you a sharecropper is someone who works on a plantation or works on a farm. They share the crop with the landowner. Okay. Now, unfortunately for these sharecroppers, they're not going to make a lot of money out of this. In fact, a lot of them are going to be experiencing a very similar lifestyle to what they had as slaves. The only difference being the technicality of them not being slaves. So I'm going to show you this graph here. Sharecroppers. Let me move myself out of the way here a little bit so you can see. Sharecroppers, okay? They're provided a certain amount of land from the landowner, and they're also given seeds and the tools they need to work this land. Now, the second step says that the sharecropper will buy food and clothing on credit from the landowner's store. So in this case here, most slaves or former slaves, they don't have any money at all. They don't have a head start. They don't have money to get started in life. So they have to borrow money or borrow goods from somebody. In this case, it happens to be the landowner. So if we have a landowner that has housing, that has clothing, that has food, well, he can let you borrow it and you can pay him back later. So as we continue on, step 3 says the sharecropper will plant and harvest his crop. After he plants and harvests his crop, the sharecropper will then give the landowner the crop to sell. Because what does this former slave know about selling these crops? He doesn't know anything about it. All he knows how to do is to plant it, grow it, harvest it, and that's it. They don't do the business side. So the landowner would take the crop, the harvest, and he would sell it. Well, we're trusting that this landowner is going to give the money that's due to this sharecropper his fair share. So once he gives his fair share to the sharecropper, well, now the next step here, step 5, says when settling up, the landowner says that the sharecropper owes more than what he has earned. Basically saying, look, man, I've had to clothe you, I've had to feed you, I've had to house you. These are a lot of very expensive things, and the amount of harvest that you got this year, well, I was only able to make a certain amount of money off of it, and that amount of money is a lot less than what it actually cost to keep you alive and to keep you on this plantation and fed. So what I'll do is I'll just add it to your tab, and we'll start over again next year. Maybe you'll have a better crop next year, and maybe we can have some more profit next year, and then you can pay me back what you owe me. Okay? So the next step says to pay the debt, the sharecropper must promise the landowner a greater share of next year's crop. What this is it's a never-ending cycle. These people are never going to get out of sharecropping, and that's the owner's plan. There is no way for these landowners, these plantation owners, to make a profit while paying these people at the same time. It's just not possible. Now, of course, advances in technology that we're going to see later with the use of tractors and plows and things like that will make it easier to make a profit when you're paying for your labor. But still, there's not as much profit as there was when we had slaves. So the cycle of sharecropper poverty is going to continue for a while. And it takes a long time for these former slaves and sharecroppers to get out of this cycle and into the real world. Now, then we also see other times where there's success stories where African Americans are starting to experience the ability to run for office, not just vote, but to actually run for office. One example of this is Hiram Rhodes Revels. You need to know this guy's name. I know you're not taking a STAR test this year, but you will probably see that name on your EOC when you're in 11th grade. So Hiram Rhodes Revels, he was the first African American to become a member of Congress. He was voted as a U.S. Senator from Mississippi. Okay. Now, Mississippi, at this time, think about 1870. The war has just been over for a few years now, 5 years. And there's already an African American in office. That shows you the shift of power. The use of voting is being used here. Now, this particular position, what makes this so unique, and this is part of why we're talking about this, this Senate seat that Hiram rebels took used to belong to Jefferson Davis. Okay? You remember Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy? Yeah, that guy. So that guy, Jefferson Davis, becomes president of the Confederacy after he was senator. He becomes president of the Confederacy. Now the Confederacy is wiped out. Jefferson Davis, along with a lot of other political and military leaders, are not allowed to hold office anymore. They're not being thrown in jail for the Civil War, but they are not allowed to hold political office. And this picture over here, this political cartoon that we see, is Jefferson Davis, who is basically out of a job. He can't hold any government jobs anymore. He looks very ashamed right now. While back in this background here, we see these men gathering around Hiram Rhodes Revels, the guy who basically took his old job. Okay, this is kind of the definition of irony here. The tides have turned, the power has shifted. So this title of this work here says "Time Works Wonders," and it does. Within a matter of 5 years, we see a shift from a slave-owning government or a pro-slavery country in the South, in the state of Mississippi, to now being shifted to where there is someone who used to be a slave sitting in the office of that old president. It's great. Okay, this is real progress that we're seeing. Unfortunately, this is a good story, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of good stories for these African Americans at this time. On our next days worth of notes, we're going to talk about some more issues that blacks faced at this time. An extension of the black codes are these Jim Crow laws. We'll talk more about that in our next set of notes, but I just want you to understand that not everyone is just super thrilled that slavery is over. Not everyone is super happy that the South has had to conform to the rules of the North. Some people are glad about it. Some people are unhappy about it. But it's just as part of Reconstruction is it's going to take time. And the fact that some of these things like black codes and the Jim Crow laws were accepted and sometimes even endorsed by some of the political leaders, that makes this process of really true equality take a long, long time. And some people would argue that today there still really isn't an exact equality between different races. And there is some merit to that argument because we do see how even 150 years, this is 150 years ago. Now, in the span of history, that's not that long, but 150 years, you've got 4, 5, 6 generations here between slavery and today, and there's still people who are facing hardships because of what happened almost 200 years ago. So definitely a topic for debate, definitely a topic to discuss. I wish we could do it in class, but we can't. So hopefully you participate in the discussion questions that we have and give me your thoughts and your input. Hope you all are having a great day. I look forward to seeing y'all soon. Take care. Don't forget to wash your hands. Bye-bye.